Hey guys, it's me, Kari. Forgive me if I look like I've been crying because, shocker, I've been crying. And I will share why and get into that more with you guys in the future because you should know what's going on with me, but not now, not today. And that's Venus in the background, my little old lady. Venus! Anyway, we're going to read some more Girl Interrupted while I have a few minutes. So this chapter is called Elementary Topography. Perhaps it's still unclear how I ended up in there. It must have been something more than a pimple. I didn't mention that I'd never seen that doctor before, that he decided to put me away after only 15 minutes. 20 maybe. What about me was so deranged that in less than half an hour a doctor would pack me off to the nut house. He tricked me though. A couple of weeks. It was closer to 2 years. I was 18. I signed myself in. I had to because I was of age. It was that or a court order, though they could have never gotten a court order against me. I didn't know that, so I signed myself in. I wasn't a danger to society. Was I a danger to myself? The 50 aspirin, but I've explained them. They were metaphorical. I wanted to get rid of a certain aspect of my character. I was performing a kind of self-abortion with those aspirin. It worked for a while. Then it stopped, but I had no heart to try again. Take it from his point of view. It was 1967. Even in lives like his, professional lives lived out in the suburbs behind shrubbery, there was a strange undertow, a tug from the other world, the drifting, drugged-out, no-last-name youth universe that knocked people off balance. One could call it threatening, to use his language. What are these kids doing? And then one of them walks into his office wearing a skirt the size of a napkin, with a mottled chin and speaking in monosyllables. Doped up, he figures. He looks again at the name jotted on the notepad in front of him. Didn't he meet her parents at a party 2 years ago? Harvard faculty, or was it MIT? Her boots are worn down, but her coat's a good one. It's a mean world out there, as Lisa would say. He can't in good conscience send her back into it to become flotsam on the sub-societal tide that washes up now and then in his office, depositing others like her, a form of preventative medicine. Am I being too kind to him? A few years ago, I read he'd been accused of sexual harassment by a former patient. But that's been happening a lot these days. It's become fashionable to accuse doctors. Maybe it was just too early in the morning for him, as well as for me, and he couldn't think of what else to do. Maybe, most likely, he was just covering his ass. My point of view is harder to explain. First I went to his office, then I got into the taxi, then I walked up the stone steps to the administration building of McLean Hospital, and if I remember correctly, sat in a chair for 15 minutes waiting to sign my freedom away. Several preconditions are necessary if you're going to do such a thing. I was having a problem with patterns. Oriental rugs, tile floors, printed curtains, things like that. Supermarkets were especially bad because of the long hypnotic checkerboard aisles. When I looked at these things, I saw other things within them. That sounds as though I was hallucinating, and I wasn't. I knew I was looking at a floor or curtain, but all the patterns seemed to contain potential representations, which in a dizzying array would flicker briefly to life. That could be a forest, a flock of birds, my second-grade class picture. Well, it wasn't. It was a rug, or whatever it was, but my glimpses of the other things it might be were exhausting. Reality was getting too dense. Something also was happening to my perceptions of people. When I looked at someone's face, I often did not maintain an unbroken connection to the concept of a face. Once you start parsing a face, it's a peculiar item, squishy, pointy, with lots of air vents and wet spots. This was the reverse of my problem with patterns. Instead of seeing too much meaning, I didn't see any meaning. But I wasn't simply going nuts, tumbling down a shaft into Wonderland. It was my misfortune, or salvation, to be at all times perfectly conscious of my misperceptions of reality. I never believed anything that I saw or thought I saw. Not only that, I correctly understood each new weird activity. Now I would say to myself, you are feeling alienated from people and unlike other people, therefore you are projecting your discomfort onto them. When you look at a face, you see a blob of rubber because you are worried that your face is a blob of rubber. This clarity made me able to behave normally, which posed some interesting questions. Was everybody seeing this stuff and acting as though they weren't? Was insanity just a matter of dropping the act? If some people didn't see these things, what was the matter with them? Were they blind or something? These questions had me unsettled. Something had been peeled back, a covering or shell that works to protect us. I couldn't decide whether the covering was something on me or something attached to everything in the world. It didn't matter, really. Wherever it had been, it wasn't there anymore. And this was the main precondition, that anything might be something else. Once I'd accepted that, it followed that I might be mad, or that someone might think me mad. How could I say for certain that I wasn't, if I couldn't say for certain that a curtain wasn't a mountain range? I have to admit, though, that I knew I wasn't mad. It was a different precondition that tipped the balance, the state of contrariety. My ambition was to negate. The world, whether dense or hollow, provoked only my negations. When I was supposed to be awake, I was asleep. When I was supposed to speak, I was silent. When a pleasure offered itself to me, I avoided it. My hunger, my thirst, my loneliness, and my boredom and fear were all weapons aimed at my enemy, the world. They didn't matter a whit to the world, of course, and they tormented me, but I got a gruesome satisfaction from my sufferings. They proved my existence. All my integrity seemed to lie in saying no. So the opportunity to be incarcerated was just too good to resist. It was a very big no, the biggest no this side of suicide. Perverse reasoning. But back of that perversity, I knew I wasn't mad and that they wouldn't keep me there locked up in a loony bin. This chapter is called Applied Topography. 2 locked doors with a 5-foot space between them where you had to stand while the nurse relocked the first door and unlocked the second. Just inside, 3 phone booths. Then a couple of single rooms, then the living room and eat-in kitchen. This arrangement ensured a good first impression for visitors. Once you turned the corner past the living room, though, things changed. A long, long hallway. Too long. 7 or 8 double rooms on one side, the nursing station centered on the other, flanked by the conference room and the hydrotherapy tub room. Lunatics to the left, staff to the right. The toilets and shower rooms were also to the right, as though the staff claimed oversight of our most private acts. A blackboard with our 20-odd names in green chalk and spaces after each, where we were in white chalk to enter our destination, departure time, and time of return whenever we left the ward. The blackboard hung directly across from the nursing station. When someone was restricted to the ward, the head nurse wrote "restricted" in green chalk beside the name. We got advance warning of an admission when a new name appeared on the list, sometimes as much as a day before the person of that name appeared on the hall. The discharged and the dead stayed on the list for a while, in silent memoriam. At the end of the terrible hall, the terrible TV room. We liked it. At least we preferred it to the living room. It was messy, noisy, smoky, and most important, it was on the left, lunatic side of things. As far as we were concerned, the living room belonged to the staff. We often agitated to move our weekly hall meeting from the living room to the TV room. Never happened. After the TV room, another turn in the hall. 2 more singles, 1 double, a toilet, and seclusion. The seclusion room was the size of the average suburban bathroom. Its only window was the chicken wire enforced one in the door that allowed people to look in and see what you were up to. You couldn't get up to much in there. The only thing in it was a bare mattress on the green linoleum floor. The walls were chipped as though somebody had been at them with fingernails or teeth. The seclusion room was supposed to be soundproof. It wasn't. You could pop into the seclusion room, shut the door, and yell for a while. When you were done, you could open the door and leave. Yelling in the TV room or hall was acting out and was not a good idea, but yelling in the seclusion room was fine. You could also request to be locked into the seclusion room. Not many people made that request. You had to request to get out, too. A nurse would look through the chicken wire and decide if you were ready to come out. Somewhat like looking at a cake through the glass of the oven door. The seclusion room etiquette was, if you weren't locked in, anybody could join you. A nurse could interrupt your yelling to try to find out why you were yelling, or some other crazy person could come in and start yelling too. Hence the request business. Freedom was the price of privacy. The real purpose of the seclusion room, though, was to quarantine people who'd gone bananas. As a group, we maintained a certain level of noisiness and misery. Anyone who sustained a higher level for more than a few hours was put in seclusion. Otherwise, the staff reasoned, we would all turn up the volume on our nuttiness and the staff would lose control. There were no objective criteria for deciding to put someone into seclusion. It was relative, like the grading curve in high school. Seclusion worked. After a day or night in there with nothing to do, most people calmed down. If they didn't, they went to maximum security. Our double locked doors, our steel mesh window screens, our kitchen stocked with plastic knives and locked unless a nurse was with us, our bathroom doors that didn't lock. All this was medium security. Maximum security was another world. And we'll do one more chapter. This one is entitled The Prelude to Ice Cream. You may know a little bit about this chapter if you've seen the film. The hospital was on a hill outside of town, the way hospitals are in movies about the insane. Our hospital was famous and had housed many great poets and singers. Did the hospital specialize in poets and singers, or was it that poets and singers specialized in madness? I vote it's the latter, speaking as one myself. Ray Charles was the most famous ex-patient. We all hoped he'd return and serenade us from the window of the drug rehabilitation ward. He never did. We had the Taylor family. James graduated to a different hospital before I arrived, but Kate and Livingston were there. In Ray Charles's absence, their North Carolina twanged blues made us sad enough. When you're sad, you need to hear your sorrow structured into sound. Robert Lowell also didn't come when I was there. Sylvia Plath had come and gone. What is it about meter and cadence and rhythm that makes their makers mad? The grounds were large and beautifully planted. They were pristine as well, since we were almost never allowed to walk around. But now and then, for a special treat, we were taken through them on the way to get ice cream. The group had an atomic structure, a nucleus of nuts surrounded by darting nervous nurse electrons charged with our protection, or protecting the residents of Belmont from us. The residents were well-heeled. Most worked as engineers or technocrats along the technology highway, Route 128. The important other type of Belmont resident was the John Bircher. The John Birch Society lay as far to the east of Belmont as the hospital lay to the west. We saw the two institutions as variations on each other. Doubtless the Birchers did not see it this way. But between us, we had Belmont surrounded. The engineers knew this, and they took care not to stare when we came into the ice cream parlor. Saying that we traveled with a group of nurses does not fully explain the situation. A complex system of privileges determined how many nurses accompanied each patient, and whether a patient could leave the grounds in the first place. The privileges started at no privileges, restricted to the ward. This was often Lisa's condition. Sometimes she was bumped up to the next rung, 2-to-1s. That meant she could leave the ward if she had 2 nurses with her, though only to go to the cafeteria or occupational therapy. Even with our high staff-to-patient ratio, 2-to-1s often meant restricted to the ward. Two nurses could rarely be spared to take Lisa by the elbows and hustle her over to dinner. Then there were 1-to-1s, a nurse and patient bound together like Siamese twins. Some patients were on 1-to-1s even on the ward, which was like having a page or a valet, or like having a bad conscience. It depended on the nurse. A lousy nurse on 1-to-1s could be a problem. It was usually a long-term assignment, so the nurse could get to understand her patient. The gradations were Byzantine. 1-to-2s, 1 nurse, 2 patients, led to group, 3 or 4 patients and 1 nurse. If you behaved in group, you got something called destination privileges. This meant telephoning the head nurse the moment you arrived at wherever you were going to let her know you were there. You had to call before coming back, too, so she could calculate time and distance in case you ran away instead. Then there was mutual escort, which was 2 relatively not crazy patients going places together. At the top, grounds, which meant you could go all over the hospital alone. Once these stations of the cross were achieved within the hospital, the whole circuit began again in the outside world. Someone who had mutual escorts or grounds would probably still be on group outside. So when we went to Bailey's in Waverly Square with our retinue of nurses, the arrangement of atoms in our molecules was more complex than it appeared to the engineer's way of sipping coffee at the counter and graciously pretending not to look at us. Lisa wouldn't have been there with us. Lisa never made it past 1-to-1s after her 3rd escape. Polly was on 1-to-1s, but that was to make her feel safe, not hemmed in, and she always came along. Georgina and I were on group, but since nobody else was on group, we were effectively on 1-to-2s. Cynthia and the Martian's girlfriend were on 1-to-2s. That made it seem like Georgina and I were as crazy as Cynthia and the Martian's girlfriend. We weren't, and there was a bit of resentment on our part. Daisy was at the top of the chart, full grounds and town. Nobody could understand why. 6 patients, 3 nurses. It was a 10 or 15-minute walk down the hill past the rose bushes and stately trees of our beautiful hospital. The farther we got from our ward, the jumpier the nurses became. By the time we hit the street, they were silent and closed in on us, and they had assumed the nonchalant look, an expression that said, I am not a nurse escorting 6 lunatics to the ice cream parlor. But they were, and we were their 6 lunatics, so we behaved like lunatics. None of us did anything unusual. We just kept up doing whatever we did back on the ward. Muttering, snarling, crying. Daisy poked people. Georgina complained about not being as crazy as those other 2. Stop acting out, a nurse would say. They were not above pinching us or giving a Daisy-like poke to try to shut us up. Nurse nips. We didn't blame them for trying, and they didn't blame us for being ourselves. It was all we had, the truth, and the nurses knew it. All right, guys, thanks for listening. I will definitely be sharing some more with you soon. And okay, so ice cream is the next chapter. That's more of the part you'll recognize if you are familiar with the movie. But yeah, I'm glad I got this accomplished today. It was one good thing, one useful thing, semi-useful, however you define that. But anyway, I love you guys so much. I really appreciate you sticking with me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll be back soon with more stuff, and Venus will be back soon with more crying. Bye, guys.